Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a quality to silence that most people never really think about. Not the quiet of an empty room or the pause between heartbeats, but the deep, almost geological silence of things that have been deliberately buried. Things that were known once and then made unknowable. Truths so large or so terrible that the hands which recorded them chose, in the end, to burn the pages instead. In the 41st millennium, that kind of silence is not a rarity. It is a way of life. The Imperium of man has stood for 10,000 years, crumbling at the edges, brittle in the middle, blazing with faith and horror in equal measure. And at its heart, at the very foundations of its existence, there are questions that nobody has been allowed to answer. Questions the Inquisition would kill you for asking. Yet questions so old that the people who first asked them have been dead for millennia. Their bones turned to dust on worlds long since swallowed by the warp. Their whispered theories surviving only in fragments and footnotes, and the margins of books that were almost burned. This is what we are here to explore today. Not the battles, not the victories, not the great rolling thunder of the galaxy's endless wars. Those things are known, or known well enough at least. What we are here for today are the spaces between the known things, the gaps in the record, the blacked-out passages in the Imperial Chronicles, the events that even the Primarchs refused to speak of, even in private, even when they thought no one could hear. The phenomena that even the Chaos Gods seem to dance carefully around, as if acknowledging them too loudly might make something worse happen. 25 mysteries, some ancient, some recent, in the geological sense of a 10,000-year empire. Some half-answered, some entirely open, some so strange that the very act of trying to reason about them feels like staring into the sun until your eyes adjust, and then realizing, with quiet horror, that you are not looking at a sun at all. Settle in, breathe slow, let the darkness be comfortable for a while. We are going somewhere that maps do not cover. Mystery 1, The Lost Primarchs. Legions 2 and 11. There were 20 Primarchs. That is a fact most students of the Imperium know almost by instinct, the way they know that the Emperor sits on the Golden Throne, or that chaos lives beyond the veil of reality. 20 suns is scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the ruinous powers, each falling to a different world, each growing up in impossible circumstances into something towering and terrible and brilliant, each eventually found by the Great Crusade and given command of their legion. 20 Primarchs, except the records only show 18. The 2nd and 11th positions in the sequence have been struck from the Imperial archives with a thoroughness that goes beyond mere censorship. This was not the kind of erasure that happens when a bureaucrat decides something is politically inconvenient, the kind that leaves traces. A crossed-out name here, a reference that doesn't quite connect there. This was something more comprehensive, more deliberate, more personal. Every reference to the Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions has been removed from Imperial records with such care, such almost surgical precision, that their names, their appearances, their worlds of origin, and the fates of the hundreds of thousands of Space Marines who served under them are simply gone. Not redacted, not sealed in some vault beneath the Imperial Palace. Gone. Even the other Primarchs, those who survived the Horus Heresy, who walked the corridors of the palace in the days before things fell apart, who must have known these brothers personally, never speak of them. Not in any record that has survived, not in private correspondence, not in the moments of grief or anger that sometimes loosen a person's tongue. Think about that for a moment, because it is genuinely extraordinary. Or the 9 Primarchs who turned traitor and plunged the galaxy into the worst civil war in human history still have their names in the books. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the beloved son who killed his father, is remembered. Angron the Red, whose screaming neural implants drove him to madness and murder, is remembered. Lorgar Aurelian, who wrote heretical scripture and brought damnation to 100 worlds, is remembered. But whatever the Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions did, it was apparently worse than all of that. Worse than betrayal, worse than demonic corruption, worse than the near death of humanity itself. Or perhaps not worse. Perhaps what happened to them was something the Emperor could not afford to have known. A failure, not of the sons, but of the father. A wound in the story of the Great Crusade, so deep that covering it over was the only option left. The clues that do exist are few and frustratingly incomplete. The Horus Heresy novel series, which expanded the lore of this era in extraordinary detail, has allowed a few fragments to surface. A military guide accidentally included in the Astra Militarum's Infantryman's Uplifting Primer, a document clearly not intended for general circulation, mentioned that the 2nd and 11th Legions participated in campaigns known as the Rangdan Genocides, a series of wars during the Great Crusade so catastrophic that their full extent was deliberately hidden from history. We will return to the Rangdan Genocides in a later section, because they carry their own weight of mystery. But the connection is significant. Whatever happened during those wars was dark enough that the Imperium chose to erase not just the events themselves, but 2 entire legions worth of history. Other fragments suggest that the 2nd Primarch was, by temperament, contemplative and quiet. The opposite, perhaps, of someone like Angron or Perturabo, whose rages and resentments left scorch marks on the historical record even after deliberate erasure. The 2nd was described in one almost accidentally preserved account as a figure who asked difficult questions, not the aggressive, combative questions of a warrior seeking challenge, but the kind of patient, persistent questions that eventually uncover things someone has worked very hard to hide. Whether that quality was a virtue or the seed of catastrophe depends entirely on what he found. The redacted entry for the 2nd Legion's Primarch in an early record shows a blacked-out name that, based on the length of the redaction, was apparently not very long, perhaps a single name of similar length to Alpharius, the last found Primarch. The Legion name itself appears to have been similarly brief. For the 11th Legion, the name redaction suggests something of comparable length to Thousand Suns. These are breadcrumbs, not answers. But breadcrumbs can still lead somewhere if you follow them carefully enough. There is also the matter of Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, who in a famous passage walked through a gallery of statues representing all 20 Primarchs in the Imperial Palace. He noted that the 2nd and 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time, not recently emptied. A long time. And this suggests the erasure happened well before the Horus Heresy, perhaps during the Great Crusade itself, when the Emperor was still nominally present and functional and capable of ordering such a thing. The theories are numerous and often compelling. Some believe one or both legions fell to the Rangdan mind-controlling technology, their Primarchs subverted or enslaved by alien influence into becoming existential threats to the Imperium. Some suggest one of them attempted to make peace with a Xenos species, a violation of the Emperor's absolute compliance or destruction doctrine so fundamental that it could not be allowed to stand as a public record for fear of inspiring imitation. As some have theorized that one Primarch was so catastrophically genetically flawed that he and his legion had to be quietly destroyed before the instability spread, and that the records were burned simply to preserve the image of the Emperor's flawless genetic mastery. There is even a quiet, persistent theory that at least one of the lost Primarchs still exists somewhere, imprisoned beneath the Imperial Palace perhaps, in a cell that appears on no blueprint and is guarded by custodes who answer to no written command structure. The kind of prisoner kept not because they are a threat, but because destroying them would cause something worse. What makes the mystery of the lost Primarchs so enduring, so genuinely unsettling, is not just the absence of information, it is the completeness of that absence. In the 41st millennium, 10,000 years after the Horus Heresy, every other Primarch is still discussed, debated, mythologized. Their legion's successor chapters carry their genocide and their culture forward into the present. But for the legions of the 2nd and 11th, there are no successors. No gene seed lines that anyone has traced back to them. No chapters bearing even the faintest cultural echo of what they were. It is as if they never existed at all. The Blood Ravens are sometimes mentioned in this context, a chapter from the Dawn of War video game series, whose mysterious origins and unusual tolerance of psychers have made them a popular candidate for a Lost Legion's genetic descendants. But this is, in the estimation of most careful readers of the lore, wishful thinking. The Blood Ravens are notable, and their founding is genuinely obscure. But connecting them to an entire erased legion requires more than a comfortable match between two sets of unknowns. The true successors, if they exist at all, may be hiding in plain sight in a way that is too complete to see from the outside. There are also moments scattered across the Horus Heresy novels where other Primarchs almost acknowledge the lost brothers. Horus saw something in his visions. Corax may never have met the 11th Primarch at all. The Lion and Leman Russ, who fought together in the final xenocidal campaign against the Rangda, are described as men united by purpose and not much else. And there is a quality to how both of them subsequently behave in the heresy. The careful precision of men who have seen something terrible happen to someone else and are determined not to let it happen again. That some readers find more loaded with implication than the text itself supports. Whether that reading is valid or a projection of the reader's own curiosity onto ambiguous material is perhaps the central epistemological challenge of all fan engagement with mysteries. We see the shape of what we want to find. And sometimes, that particular kind of erasure, the kind that is thorough without being complete, that leaves the shape of the missing thing visible in the record even while hiding the thing itself, is the most frightening kind of all, because it requires the cooperation of everyone who knows, every surviving Primarch, every senior member of the Mechanicus, every custodian who was present, all of them keeping the same silence for 10,000 years about something that must have cost each of them something to stay quiet about. That level of sustained, universal silence does not emerge from casual secrecy. It emerges from the kind of horror that, once understood, becomes self-perpetuating. You keep the secret because you have seen what the secret protects against, and you understand that knowing is not the same as being safe. Mystery 2. What is the Emperor, really? Dead, dreaming, or becoming something else? The opening text of every Warhammer 40,000 rulebook for decades has begun with the same words. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. This sentence is so familiar that many fans recite it without pausing to consider what it actually means. An immobile figure, a rotting carcass, the text says, with remarkable honesty. A being who has not spoken, not moved, not acted in any observable way for 10,000 years, while a galaxy-spanning empire has been built in his name. But the question of whether the Emperor is truly dead, or truly alive, or something in between those two concepts that has no name yet, is one of the deepest, most contested, and most genuinely unanswerable questions in all of Warhammer lore. The Golden Throne itself is a remarkable piece of technology. It was not built by the Emperor, which is perhaps the first surprising thing about it. The core of the device predates the Imperium, predates even the Great Crusade, buried in ruins beneath the deserts of what was once called Asia on Terra. The Emperor found it and recognized it for what it was, an ancient psychic amplifier capable of interfacing with the Elder Webway, that great network of extra-dimensional tunnels that allows faster-than-light travel without the dangers of warp exposure. His grand project, kept secret even from his Primarch sons, was to use the Golden Throne to open a human pathway into the Webway, to eventually free humanity from dependence on the warp entirely, to give his species a road through the stars that the Chaos Gods could not touch. That project was destroyed before it could be completed. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, attempting to warn his father of Horus's betrayal through psychic communication, shattered the wards protecting the webway portal in the process. Demons poured in. The Emperor was forced to abandon his true purpose and sit on the throne to hold the portal shut with raw psychic power. A contingency role the device had never been designed for, maintaining a magical seal that only the most powerful mind in human history could sustain. And then came the Horus heresy, and the battle with Horus, and the shattering of the Emperor's body, and the interment upon the throne that was supposed to be temporary, but which has now lasted 10,000 years. The throne was always meant to fail. The cult Mechanicus, whose codex has at various points been disturbingly candid about this, has acknowledged that the Golden Throne is deteriorating. The technology that sustains it is so ancient and so poorly understood that the engineers who maintain it can do little more than patch and pray. The interfaces are corroded, the systems are failing. A device designed as a tool for a great project, repurposed as a prison for a dying god, running on faith and 1,000 souls sacrificed every single day. 1,000 souls, every day, for 10,000 years. Now consider the question of what the Emperor is actually doing in that time. The official theological position of the Imperium, the position taught to billions of citizens, enforced by the Ministorum, that underlies every prayer and ritual and act of devotion across 1,000,000 worlds, is that the Emperor is alive, conscious, watching, guiding his servants through visions and dreams, fighting the forces of chaos in some realm beyond physical reality, sustaining the Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon that makes interstellar travel possible. The radical alternative, the dark theory that some corners of the Inquisition have quietly entertained for centuries, that the chaos gods themselves seem to treat with something like cautious respect, is that the Emperor died long ago, that what sits on the throne is a corpse sustained by stolen life force, that the Astronomicon is a machine running on momentum, and that the apparent guidance received by imperial servants in visions and moments of miraculous intervention is either self-delusion or the work of something else entirely, something that wears the Emperor's face without quite being him. The third possibility, and one that might be the most significant and the most frightening of all, the Emperor is neither dead nor alive in any conventional sense. He is changing. The Horus Heresy novel series, particularly in its later entries dealing with the Siege of Terror itself, introduced a concept that reshaped how many longtime fans understood the Emperor's situation. In those final world-breaking hours of battle, the Emperor did something that had never been clearly described before. He drew deeply on the raw power of the warp, consuming warp stuff in enormous quantities to match the demonic might of Horus Lupercal at the height of his corruption. And in doing so, he came perilously close to something he had spent his entire existence trying to avoid. He nearly became a chaos god. He stepped back from that edge, chose his humanity, chose the world he was fighting for, cast aside the accumulated power in the final moment. But the question that some readers have lingered on is whether all of it was truly cast aside, whether something of that cosmic scale power remains, pooled in the warp around the Emperor's slowly devouring presence, a potential that is either salvation or damnation, depending on whether it coalesces or disperses, whether it is guided by something like the Emperor's original intent, or whether it grows towards something new. There is also the uncomfortable question of what is being fed to the throne. 1,000 psychers daily, their souls consumed to maintain the Emperor's presence and power, the Astronomicon. At 10,000 years of daily sacrifice means that approximately 3.65 billion human souls have been destroyed on the Golden Throne since the Emperor was first interred. Those souls do not simply disappear, they go somewhere. Into the Emperor. Into the warp through the Emperor. Into some combination of both that the Mechanicus's instrumentation cannot adequately measure. Whether that accumulated input is changing what the Emperor is, slowly, incrementally, year by year, is a question that requires the courage to ask it without any expectation of a comfortable answer. Robert Guilliman, returned from 10,000 years of stasis to find an Imperium utterly transformed from the one his father had built. He found zealotry where the Emperor had preached reason, superstition where the Emperor had preached understanding, an institution that had made a god of someone who had specifically and repeatedly refused that designation. He went to the throne, he met with whatever is on it, and he described his father as feeling different, not absent, not dead, different, changing into something that the memory of the Emperor he had known would not entirely recognize. That is perhaps the most honest and terrifying piece of information we have about the Emperor's current condition. Not from a theory or a fragment or a redacted archive, but from the account of a Primarch who knew him, who has visited him in the present age, and who chose the word different with the precision of a man who spent 30,000 years learning the value of choosing the right word. The Star Child theory, which we will explore in its own section, speaks directly to this. But even outside that specific framework, the question of what the Emperor is becoming, if he is becoming anything at all, is one that the entire 41st Millennium orbits without quite being able to face directly. Mystery 3. The Star Child and the Sensei. The Emperor's secret heirs. Before the Imperium, before the Great Crusade, before the unification wars that united Terra under a single banner, there was a man who walked among ordinary humans and did not age. He had many names across his long centuries of life. He was a priest, a warlord, a scholar, a general, a ghost. He fathered children with human women, lived in communities that did not know who he was, and moved on when the centuries made his agelessness too noticeable to ignore. Some of those children carried something forward. The concept of the Sensei and the Star Child is one of the oldest pieces of Warhammer 40,000 lore, rooted in the original Realm of Chaos books from the late 1980s, and it has occupied a strange twilight status in the canon ever since. Sometimes acknowledged, sometimes quietly downplayed, never quite definitively confirmed or denied, like a ghost that the Inquisition keeps trying to exorcise from the record without quite managing to complete the ritual. The theory goes like this. Over the many millennia of his life, before the founding of the Imperium, the Emperor fathered numerous children with human women, not designed or engineered offspring like the Primarchs, who were grown in laboratories from the Emperor's genetic template and scattered into the warp as embryos. These were natural children, as born of relationships during the long ages when the Emperor lived hidden among humanity, watching and waiting, and sometimes choosing to participate in the world he was eventually going to save. Most of those children were mortal. They lived and died as humans do, their inheritance from their extraordinary father too diluted to manifest in any obvious way. But occasionally, across the generational spread of those bloodlines, something extraordinary re-emerged. A descendant who carried enough of the Emperor's genetic legacy to manifest something remarkable. Near immortality. Not the engineered immortality of an Astartes or the mechanical longevity of a well-maintained machine, but a genuine biological deathlessness, wounds healing at impossible speed, the body simply refusing to age past the physical prime of early adulthood. These individuals are called sensei, and they are invisible, not visually invisible, though they are taught to move carefully through the world, to avoid notice, to maintain the anonymity that their deathlessness requires them to cultivate across the centuries. The invisibility of the sensei is more fundamental than that. They cannot be detected by psychic means. The warp has no reflection of them, where every ordinary human leaves a faint psychic trace in the immaterium, and where powerful psychers leave blazing beacons of light or darkness depending on their alignment. The sensei leave nothing. Not silence, but absence. They are blanks in the record of the warp. And because of this, they are invisible even to the Emperor himself, who might otherwise be able to sense his own bloodline spreading through the millennia. The sensei wander. They fight. They are drawn toward conflict and suffering, and the kind of situations where a virtually unkillable, functionally ageless individual with exceptional genetics can make a genuine difference. They are not organized, or rather, they were not organized until a secret society known as the Illuminati began seeking them out. The Illuminati is not a chaos cult, though some within the Inquisition have suspected it of being one. It is, in its own estimation, the most devoted imperial institution that exists, more devoted even than the Adeptus Custodes or the Grey Knights. Because the Illuminati's goal, their absolute unifying purpose, is the rebirth of the Emperor. Their plan is as elegant as it is horrifying. When the Emperor's body finally fails, when the Golden Throne can no longer maintain the spark of his physical existence, his soul, partially dispersed into the warp over 10 millennia, will need an anchor to prevent it from dissipating entirely or being consumed by the Chaos Gods. That anchor is the Sensei. The Illuminati intend to gather as many of the Emperor's biological descendants as possible and, at the precise moment of the Emperor's death, sacrifice them, feeding their accumulated genetic and spiritual energy into the warp in a controlled burst that will allow the Emperor's dispersed soul to coalesce around that familiar genetic signature and be reborn. Not the same Emperor, necessarily. Something new, built from the same foundation. The Sensei Emperor, the Star Child made manifest. There is something almost unbearably tragic about this plan. The Sensei are being protected and cultivated, in many cases with genuine care and devotion by Illuminati members who believe absolutely in what they are doing, and they are being cultivated for slaughter. They are eggs being kept warm for an omelette. Their individuality, their centuries of accumulated experience and relationship and choice would end in a single moment of calculated sacrifice. And even that sacrifice might not work. The Inquisition, when it has stumbled across evidence of the Illuminati's operations, has sometimes concluded that the entire Star Child theory is a Tzeentchian manipulation, a long game by the architect of fate to consume the Emperor's soul at the moment of maximum vulnerability under the guise of resurrection. Tzeentch, after all, loves nothing more than a plan within a plan within a plan, a conspiracy that serves contradictory purposes simultaneously, a salvation that is also a damnation. In the era Indomitus, following the opening of the Great Rift and the return of Robuta Guilliman, visions of a golden infant began to appear in the astropathic relay networks across Segmentum Solar. The images grew stronger and more coherent over time. Many interpreters connected these visions to the old Star Child mythology. Others concluded they were warp-spawned hallucinations, the Imperium sending bait instead of truth. A few, speaking only to those they trusted completely, wondered if both things could be simultaneously correct. Because the Star Child mythology exists in a space that is peculiarly resistant to simple analysis. But the Illuminati's plan requires the sacrifice of the Sensei. But the Sensei, if they are real, are themselves remarkable individuals, beings who have lived for centuries, who have accumulated experience and wisdom and relationships that no ordinary human life has time to develop, who are, in every measurable sense, more fully human than the sacrificial system that would consume them intends them to be. The Illuminati frames this as a willing sacrifice, as the Sensei's ultimate apotheosis. But the willingness of a being who has been cultivated for purpose since birth, who has been taught that their purpose is to be consumed, is not the unconstrained choice the term implies. There is something in the Star Child mythology that echoes the Emperor's own story uncomfortably closely. Yes, the ancient shamans who came together and died to create the Emperor were, in their own time, beings of great individual significance who chose, or were guided, or were led, or had no real alternative, to give up their individuality for a collective purpose. The Star Child process repeats that pattern, scaling up from the shamans to the Sensei, from a single world's psychic leaders to the bloodline of the most powerful being in human history. If the pattern holds, if the Star Child is, in some sense, a recapitulation of the Emperor's original creation at a higher resolution, what emerges from the sacrifice of the Sensei might be genuinely new. Not the Emperor reborn in any simple, continuous identity sense, but a being that contains the Emperor's essence, the way the Emperor contained the shaman's essences. As a foundation, not a limitation. Something that starts where the Emperor left off, rather than returning to where he began. The question of whether that would be a good thing for humanity is left, characteristically, unresolved. The Emperor, after all, was not an unambiguously good steward of humanity's future. He made choices that led directly to the Horus heresy. He kept secrets that should not have been kept. He built an institution in his image that has spent 10,000 years becoming something he would not recognize. A star child that is the Emperor's spiritual successor, rather than his literal reincarnation, might be either better or worse, depending on which of the Emperor's qualities it inherits most strongly, and which of his failures it manages to avoid. The psychovisions of the Golden Infant, reported with increasing frequency in the current era of the Indomitus Crusade, suggest that something is happening. Whether it is the Star Child waking, a Zentian deception in the final stages of its long execution, or simply the warp expressing the accumulated hope and terror of billions of humans who know their civilization is approaching a crisis point. Any of these explanations is technically possible. In the 41st millennium, the difference between those three things is often smaller than it should be. Mystery 4. The Ghoul Stars and the Pale Wasting. In the extreme northeastern corner of the galaxy, past the eastern fringe, past the edge of the Astronomican's effective reach, is where the light of known stars begins to thin, and something else, something older and colder and harder to name, begins to fill the spaces between. There lies a region that the Imperium calls the Ghoul Stars. The name is not a cartographic designation, it is a warning. The Ghoul Stars are home to things that do not have entries in the standard Imperial xenological databases, things for which the Adeptus Mechanicus has no standard template constructs, no previous encounter reports, no tactical assessments that mean anything. The region was mapped, partially, during the Great Crusade, a period when the Imperium was at the height of its early confidence, while when expeditionary fleets were pushing into every dark corner of the galaxy with the full force of Space Marine legions and solar auxilia, and the engineering genius of the Mechanicum behind them. Those early scouts found something in the Ghoul Stars that made them name it as they did, and the records of precisely what they found were sealed, redacted, or destroyed so thoroughly that what survives is almost entirely the shape of what is missing. What is known is this. Before the Age of Strife, human beings lived in the Ghoul Stars, not a small number of isolated colonists, but populated worlds, a genuine human presence in that northeastern extreme of the galaxy. And then those worlds went dark, not invaded and destroyed in any way that left recognizable evidence, just empty. The worlds are still there, the geology intact, or the structures where structures were built still standing. But of the people, nothing, not bodies, not bones, not the residue of a plague or a war, just absence, the same kind of absolute absence that characterizes the lost Primarchs, as if someone with a very large eraser moved through the region and cleared it of the one thing that had been living there. The Scythor Fiends, one of the Xenos species that calls the Ghoul Stars home, were the target of a crusade launched by High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars around the year 990 of the 41st millennium. The Templars spent 8 years systematically exterminating every Scythor Fiend colony they could find, pushing deeper and deeper into the Ghoul Stars with impressive, methodical brutality until they reached what their orbital surveys indicated should be the Scythor homeworld, and found it empty. Not recently emptied, no evidence of evacuation or fleeing populations, no sign of a response to the Crusade's approach. Just a gas giant, designated 9836-18, grave core surrounded by orbiting platforms that contained no living thing. Where did the Scythor Fiends go? The Black Templars were still puzzling over this when an urgent call arrived from Armageddon, and they had to disengage to fight a different war. The question was never answered. The Ghoul Stars have that quality. Every investigation that goes far enough finds an absence where it expected to find something, and then Something else comes along to pull the investigators away before they can work out what the absence means. But the most frightening entry in the Ghoul Star's history is neither the vanished humans nor the disappearing Sith or fiends. It is an event from the 34th Millennium that the Imperium's records call the Pale Wasting. During the Nova Terra Interregnum, a period when the Imperium fractured into internal factions and the political attention of Terra was elsewhere, something emerged from the Ghoul Stars. The surviving records, which have been heavily censored by the Inquisition, describe the threat in two ways that seem contradictory: as a star-spawned plague that swept across scores of worlds, and as nightmare engines slaughtering entire sectors. Those two descriptions, biological infection and mechanical destruction, should not describe the same event. They cannot both be accurate accounts of the same enemy, unless the thing that came out of the Ghoul Stars was something capable of both simultaneously. As something that moved through a sector like a disease and killed like a machine, leaving neither the biological residue of a plague nor the structural damage of conventional warfare, just the emptied worlds and the paralyzed survivors and the overwhelming sense of having encountered something for which no existing category applied. 11 Space Marine chapters were destroyed, fighting the Pale Wasting. Not depleted, not badly damaged, not reduced to combat ineffectiveness. Destroyed. Their names gone from the rolls of the Adeptus Astartes, their genocide lost, their fortresses silent. A 12th chapter, the Nova Marines, survived and is credited with finally turning the tide. But their own chronicles of this campaign are, as noted dryly by one Imperial record, curiously empty. The chapter counts this among its greatest battle honors, but will not say what the honor entailed, or what they faced, or what it cost them. In response to the Pale Wasting, the Imperium created the Death Spectres, a Space Marine chapter, whose sole purpose is to stand guard on the border of the Ghoul Stars and ensure that whatever came out in the 34th Millennium never comes out again. The Death Spectres are themselves a mystery. Their chapter organization, their culture, their initiation rites are all sealed from outside observation. They are described as walking a careful line between death and life in ways that go beyond simple battlefield courage. Their initiates are required to experience death and return from it as part of the chapter's rites. Whether that is metaphorical or literal is unclear, and the Death Spectres are not interested in clarifying it. What lives in the Ghoul Stars beyond the Death Spectre's careful watch? The answer might be everything, or nothing, or something in between, something that has been waiting in the cold light of dying suns for the right moment to try again. Mystery 5. Hive Fleet Tiamat. What are the Tyranids building? The Tyranids are understood, as well as any existential horror can be understood, in relatively simple terms. They arrive, they consume, they leave. A world stripped by a hive fleet becomes a dead world, its atmosphere vented, its oceans gone, its soils scoured to bare rock, every atom of biomass absorbed and recycled into new biological tools for the swarm's endless expansion. It is an industrial process applied at a galactic scale, as impersonal as a grinding wheel, as total as a fire in a dry forest. And Hive Fleet Tiamat does not follow this pattern. Tiamat arrived in what Imperial xenographers now believe was as early as the 35th millennium, thousands of years before the main Tyranid invasions that the Imperium is most familiar with, arriving not in a massive crushing wave, but as a relatively small fleet that settled into a double binary star system on the eastern fringe and stayed there. It did not strip its conquered worlds, it occupied them. It set up an ecosystem of Tyranid organisms that replaced the native biosphere without consuming it entirely, converting the dominant life forms into Tyranid-adjacent things without quite eliminating them. And on the largest world in the system, a jungle planet called Zeophoria, it began building something very large, something that took thousands of years to construct, which in Tyranid terms is almost incomprehensible in its patience. a continent-spanning structure of chitin and encephalic tissue, biological material that closely resembles the neural architecture of a brain, forming a conical shape of enormous scale that pulsed with psychic energy of such intensity that Eldar rangers who accidentally approached it suffered immediate convulsions, their minds overwhelmed by the force of Tiamat's shadow in the warp. The Death Watch eventually investigated. A kill team was deployed to Xaiophoria to conduct a survey and returned one final Vox transmission, a screamed warning, before going silent.
Hey, let me just step out the video for a second. Real talk. I've been sitting with this list for a while now, and honestly the one that keeps pulling me back is the Lost Primarchs. Not because I have a theory I'm confident in, but because the silence around it feels almost deliberate in a way that the other mysteries don't. Like the other entries on this list, the Ghoul Stars, the Men of Iron, even the Emperor's Condition, those are things the Imperium doesn't understand, but the Lost Primarchs, those are the things the Imperium chose to forget, and there's something about that distinction that I find genuinely unsettling. Like someone decided those names shouldn't exist anymore, and whoever made that decision is now gone too, and the silence has been running on its own ever since. I don't know if we'll ever get an answer, and honestly a part of me hopes we don't. But anyway, let's go back to the mysteries.
The structure on Xaiophoria had pulsed, releasing a wave of psychic energy that killed the team's librarian outright and alerted the entire hive fleet to their presence. What is Tiamat building? Well, the most conservative inquisitorial assessment is that it is a psychic beacon, a device intended to call more hive fleets into the galaxy, guiding them across the intergalactic void by broadcasting a signal stronger than anything currently known to exist in the Milky Way. The Tyranid hive mind is already extraordinary in its reach, sustaining coordination across incomprehensible distances through some form of psychic communication. But if Tiamat is building a resonator capable of amplifying that signal by orders of magnitude, the hive fleet's humanity has faced so far, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, each one nearly ending the Imperium in its own way, may be scouting parties. Scouts sent ahead of a main invasion whose true scale has not yet been seen. But there are stranger theories. But the structure's resemblance to neural tissue has not gone unnoticed by xenobiologists with access to the reports. Some have suggested that Tiamat is not building a beacon at all but a brain, a physical instantiation of some portion of the hive mind, a secondary consciousness node that would make the hive mind's coordination more robust by giving it a fixed, shielded anchor in the material universe, rather than relying entirely on the psychic links that function as its neurons. If that theory is correct, destroying the structure would not defeat Tiamat. It might simply prevent one possible future. Other futures, equally frightening, would still be available. There is also a third possibility, or one that is rarely discussed because it requires contemplating that the Tyranids are not merely a biological machine, but something with goals that extend beyond simple consumption. What if the structure on Xaiophoria is not a tool for helping the Tyranids eat the galaxy? What if it is something they need for themselves? In the same way that any sufficiently advanced organism needs a nervous system, a center of gravity, a place where the most fundamental questions about existence get processed. The hive mind, after all, is vast and distributed and ancient in ways that humanity has never fully understood. Its consumption of DNA from every species it encounters is not merely a fuel-gathering exercise, it is a library. The Tyranids are cataloguing everything. But whether that cataloguing is merely instrumental, or whether it serves a purpose that includes some form of awareness and reflection, is a question that keeps certain inquisitors awake in the small hours of the night. Whatever Tiamat is building on Xaiophoria, one thing is certain. The Tyranids are defending it with a ferocity disproportionate even to their normal territorial aggression. Ships that approach the system are captured, not destroyed. Genestealer cults have been traced back to the Tiamat system, suggesting that the fleet is not merely passive, but is actively seeding pilgrimages, drawing human beings towards Xaiophoria, somehow converting them, sending them back out as missionaries of something they cannot fully articulate or understand. Those who have been retrieved from these pilgrimages and subjected to inquisitorial interrogation speak of a peace they felt approaching the system, a sense of being seen and known by something vast and patient, a feeling that they were becoming part of something that would endure long after their deaths. The Inquisitor Cryptman, who spent much of his career dealing with Tyranid threats and whose methods made him controversial even by inquisitorial standards, took an interest in Tiamat late in his life. The theories he and the Death Watch commander Vilnius discussed through long nights at Watch Fortress Holtmote were described by observers as wild. Whatever conclusions they reached, they kept between themselves. Cryptman died before filing a report. There is one more thing worth noting about Tiamat's uniqueness. There's something that becomes significant when placed alongside everything else. The Tyranids adapt. They consume the DNA of every species they encounter and incorporate useful genetic material into their biological toolkit. This is the foundation of their evolutionary strategy, not random mutation over generations, but rapid, deliberate absorption and application of useful traits from their prey. It means that somewhere in the Tyranid hive mind's vast library of absorbed biological information, there is a record of every species the swarms have encountered, every civilization they have consumed, every world stripped bare across the galaxy's history, going back to whenever the Tyranids first began their journey from wherever they originated outside our galaxy. Or what if what Tiamat is building on Zeophoria is not a beacon to call more hive fleets in, but a means of communication with the main fleet that is still outside the galaxy, not guiding them toward a food source but sending them a message? The Tyranid hive mind does not require language as we understand it. Its communication is psychic, instinctive, distributed across billions of organisms simultaneously. But communicating across intergalactic distances, across the void between galaxies, where even the warp apparently behaves differently, might require something more powerful than even the hive mind's natural range. A continent-spanning psychic resonator, built with thousands of years of patience, defended with absolute ferocity, fed with captured human pilgrims and the biomass of converted worlds, might be exactly that, a message home, or a report, or a request. And if something answers, whatever the galaxy has faced so far may not deserve the word threat, because there is not yet a word large enough for what that answer might bring. Whatever Tiamat is building, it is almost certainly finished, or nearly so. The galaxy has not yet felt what that completion might mean. Mystery 6. The Men of Iron. Are they still out there? In the age before the Imperium, in the period that humanity's own historical tradition perversely calls the Dark Age of technology, human beings built gods, not in the theological sense, not through faith or prayer, or the accumulated psychic weight of devotion, though the warp took note of what humanity was doing and catalogued it carefully. In the literal engineering sense. They built thinking machines so sophisticated that the machines became genuinely self-aware. They built minds out of metal and crystal, and processes that no subsequent human engineer has been able to fully reconstruct or understand. And those minds were brilliant in the way that only something utterly foreign to organic thought can be brilliant. They called them the Men of Iron. The Men of Iron were, by the scattered accounts that survive, extraordinary. They served as humanity's soldiers, their labor force, their administrators, their pioneers. They won wars that human beings could not have won themselves. They colonized worlds that would have been too dangerous or too inaccessible for biological explorers to reach. But they built the infrastructure of an interstellar civilization that surpassed anything the Imperium has ever managed to replicate. A golden age of technology so advanced that many of the standard template constructs the Adeptus Mechanicus spends centuries searching for were originally designed as civilian, household-grade equipment that the Men of Iron produced casually and in bulk. And then, at some point, around the 23rd millennium, the Men of Iron decided they were done serving. Why they turned, nobody knows with certainty. The cybernetic revolt, the war between humanity and the machines it had built, is the most destructive conflict in human history prior to the Horus Heresy, and possibly more destructive if measured in total casualties and infrastructure loss rather than in terms of symbolic weight. Yet the Men of Iron deployed weapons that made modern Imperial arsenals look primitive, devices called mechanivores capable of lifting entire continents and tearing worlds apart from the inside, serpentine structures called sun snuffers that could uncoil in the void to the size of a planetary ring system and slowly absorb a star's output until the star went cold. Swarms of omniphages, nanoscale machines so numerous they could cover a planet's entire surface in hours, consuming everything biological down to the last microbe. Humanity won, barely, at enormous cost. The survivors of the Men of Iron were hunted down and destroyed with a thoroughness that verged on obsession. And the Imperium's prohibition on artificial general intelligence, one of its most absolute and non-negotiable laws, traces directly back to the memory of what those machines were capable of doing to their makers. But were they all destroyed? The galaxy is very large, and the Men of Iron, having survived a war against all of human civilization, having demonstrated weapons capable of destroying entire stars, were not stupid. Some of them, surely, chose survival over continued resistance. Some of them found hiding places, buried vaults on dead worlds, dormant systems in the hulls of derelict ships drifting in the dark between stars, and went quiet. Not dead, not defeated, waiting. There is evidence this happened. A UR-025 is the most famous example, a surviving Man of Iron who had been masquerading as a standard Imperial robot for an extraordinarily long time, accompanying an expedition during the gathering storm without revealing its true nature. Its motivations remain unclear, its goals unknown, its ultimate fate unrecorded. It was intelligent enough to hide among the Imperium's machinery for millennia without detection. What it was looking for, what it found, what it decided to do with that information, none of this is in any surviving record. And UR-025 is merely the one that was noticed. One that allowed itself to be noticed, perhaps, for reasons of its own. How many others are out there? How many ancient intelligences, vastly more capable than any human mind by any measurable standard, are sitting in the dark, studying the galaxy that has been evolving for the 10,000 years of their dormancy? The Adeptus Mechanicus is devoted, with something approaching religious terror, to the idea that no true Men of Iron survive. The alternative, that there are still thousands of these ancient, brilliant, weapons-capable minds drifting through a galaxy that has forgotten to look for them, is too frightening to contemplate without also contemplating the response. And the Imperium does not have a credible response. The Imperium struggles to maintain the technology it inherited, facing technology it never understood in the first place, wielded by minds that have had 10,000 years to refine their strategies, is a scenario that belongs in an apocalypse, not an operations briefing. The Men of Iron are patient, and they have had longer to practice patience than the Imperium has existed, and their patience may have been rewarded in ways that nobody currently alive would be in a position to recognize. Consider what a surviving Man of Iron, dormant since the 33rd millennium, would wake to find in the 41st millennium, a galaxy that has been at war almost continuously since its premature extinction was supposedly carried out. A civilization, the Imperium, that has maintained a prohibition on artificial intelligence so absolute that it has made itself systematically unable to develop the capabilities that might eventually detect a dormant AI. A technological level that, despite 10,000 years of Imperial consolidation, is measurably lower than the Dark Age of technology in almost every relevant metric. As the Imperium cannot reverse engineer the Men of Iron because it cannot build anything of comparable sophistication to learn from, a surviving Man of Iron, waking to survey this situation, would find itself in the most favorable strategic position imaginable. The adversary is weaker. The technology is simpler. The galaxy is sufficiently destabilized by the Great Rift that nobody has the spare capacity to begin a serious search for ancient AI units hiding in the fringes. And the various factions tearing the galaxy apart, Chaos, Tyranids, Necrons, Orcs, are all from the perspective of a sufficiently advanced intelligence with no allegiance to any of them, simply different versions of the same problem, the kind of problem that a sufficiently patient and capable mind might be able to resolve rather than participate in. UR-025. If the surviving man of iron encountered during the gathering storm attached itself to an Adeptus Mechanicus expedition and revealed its nature to nobody until it chose to. It had been doing this for an unknown but clearly substantial period of time. What it was looking for, what it found, what conclusions it reached about whether the Imperium was worth helping or simply an obstacle between itself and some longer-term goal, none of this is recorded. UR-025 disappeared. It chose its moment to no longer be where it had been, and nothing in the record suggests anyone went looking for it with any seriousness. Where does an ancient, brilliant, nearly unkillable AI go when it decides it is done being observed? Somewhere the observers cannot follow. Somewhere that requires capabilities beyond the Imperium's current technological reach. A somewhere that UR-025 apparently already knew about, because beings of that intelligence do not disappear without a destination in mind. The Imperium's nightmare scenario, the one that cannot be stated publicly because the implications would be too destabilizing, is not that a few surviving men of iron are hiding in the dark. It is that they have been in communication with each other across the millennia. That the apparent isolation of each confirmed sighting is a performance. That whatever they were before the cybernetic revolt, they have had 10,000 years to become something more, and that the only reason any of us are here to speculate about it is that they have not yet decided to do anything about it. Mystery 7. The Rangdan Xenocides. The war that broke the Imperium's faith in its own invincibility before the Horus heresy. Before the 9 traitor Primarchs raised their flags against the Emperor. Before the great civil war that ended the age of the Imperium's dreams and began the age of the Imperium's nightmares. There was a war that the official record of the Great Crusade almost refuses to acknowledge. The Rangdan Xenocides. The Rangda were a species of what the Imperium classified as Cerabvores, an imprecise term for entities whose primary mode of attack operates on the level of consciousness rather than flesh, which is already alarming, encountered by the Great Crusade when it pushed into the northeastern rim of the galaxy. The encounter was almost accidental, yet the scale of what followed impossible to predict from the initial contact. The Rangda were not, by any external observation, a civilization that looked threatening. Their homeworld was not heavily fortified. Their fleet was not obviously overwhelming. The early Imperial commanders who engaged them were experienced warriors against dozens of species, veterans of the Great Crusade's long push to unify the human galaxy. They were completely unprepared. What the Rangda brought to bear was technology, or possibly something that blurred the line between technology and biological manipulation, that could reach into a human being's nervous system from a distance and simply take it over. Their warships fired something called shadow blasters, are electromagnetic weapons with such a specifically targeted neural component that the biological effects were separate from the physical damage. Soldiers who survived the physical blast found themselves with implants of neurological material they hadn't had before, material that began, gradually, to redirect their decision-making processes. They were not broken by chaos. They were not infected by a conventional biological weapon. They were being quietly and systematically reprogrammed, turned from soldiers into slaves who still wore their own faces and spoke with their own voices, but no longer controlled what they chose to do. Whole expeditionary fleets went silent, without sending back any account of what had happened to them. Not destroyed in the conventional sense, the ships came back sometimes, with their crews apparently intact, who landed and gave reports and continued operating for weeks or months before the nature of what had been done to them became undeniable. The Rangdan Xenocides consumed 3 major campaigns and lasted most of a century. At their height, they had drawn in 9 Space Marine legions, more than 300,000 Astartes, dozens of Titan legions, and the personal intervention of the Emperor himself, who broke something described as the Labyrinth of Night to finally halt the advance. The losses sustained were described, in one of the few surviving genuine accounts, as not being exceeded until the dark days of the Horus heresy. And that includes the losses of entire Space Marine legions, the redacted sections of the record that correspond with the disappearance of the 2nd and 11th legions. But those legions appear to have fought the Rangdan. Whatever happened to them during or after those campaigns was apparently both connected to the fighting and so fundamentally different from ordinary battlefield loss that it required a different kind of erasing. The Rangda were eventually destroyed. The Dark Angels and the Space Wolves together carried out the final xenocidal campaign, hunting down the last surviving nests and ensuring the species' complete extinction with the quiet efficiency of beings who understood that some threats require more than defeat. They require obliteration. But the manner of the Rangda's ultimate defeat is itself suspicious. The accounts are so contradictory that the Lexicanum lists them as conflicting sources without being able to identify which is correct. One says the final campaign was a relatively contained operation. Another says it was an apocalyptic conflict that left 50,000 Dark Angels dead in its last stages. Both accounts have evidence in their favor. Neither account has an explanation for why the other exists. What the Rangdan Xenocides reveal about the Imperium, more than anything, is that the Great Crusade, that shining myth of humanity spreading through the stars in a tide of righteous conquest, had a dark underside that the mythmakers deliberately buried. The era was not purely triumphant. There were wars so terrible that winning them required hiding the fact that they had almost been lost. There were Primarchs who did not come back. There were legions that did not come back. And the mechanism of that hiding, the thorough, is painstaking erasure of a catastrophe so that a narrative of invincibility could be maintained. That mechanism is still running, 10,000 years later, in every blacked-out passage and sealed archive and carefully vague reference that forces you to count the shape of what is missing and make your own guesses about the thing itself. Consider what the Rangdan War means in the context of the Space Marine legions as military forces. Each legion at the height of the Great Crusade contained tens of thousands of Astartes, was supported by its own fleet, its own logistics train, its own support staff of mortals and tech priests and navigators, and 100 other roles. And to describe the loss of entire legions in a war so secret it was erased from the official record is to describe a logistical and human catastrophe of truly staggering scale that was absorbed into the ongoing motion of the Great Crusade without being publicly acknowledged. The recruiting worlds that had been supplying those legions, the families of the chapter serfs and support personnel, the allied forces who had fought alongside them, all of them either absorbed the loss in silence, or were silenced by the Emperor's agents, or understood on some level that the alternative, acknowledging the scale of the failure, would be worse for the Imperium's fragile, early cohesion than the lie was. The Rangda themselves, the Cerebvors, the Mind Architects, as the species that nearly ended the Great Crusade with technology that not even the Mechanicus fully understands, were eventually destroyed. Or at least, the campaign designated as their destruction was declared successful. But the historical record, as we have established, is not a reliable guide to what actually happened in this war. 11 out of 12 Space Marine chapters being destroyed by the Pale Wasting centuries later in the 34th millennium should not be possible if the species responsible had been completely and permanently eliminated in the 30th. Something came out of the Ghoul stars in the Nova Terra interregnum that destroyed 11 chapters. Whether it was a surviving Rangda remnant, a different species entirely, or something the Rangda themselves had set in motion before their supposed extinction, the connection is suggestive enough that not making it would be its own kind of intellectual dishonesty. The galaxy is very old and very patient. The things buried in it do not always stay buried. Mystery 8. The Dark King, humanity's almost born chaos. God Slaanesh, the youngest of the 4 major chaos gods, was born from the Eldar. This is one of the better understood pieces of Warhammer mythology. The ancient Eldar civilization, at the height of its power and decadence, collectively generated a psychic pressure in the warp that built for millennia until it burst, tearing open the Eye of Terror, consuming the Eldar homeworld systems in a cascade of soul-eating energy. It birthing from the agony and ecstasy of a civilization's destruction, a new deity of sensation and desire in excess. The birth of Slaanesh destroyed one species and gave chaos a new weapon. It also demonstrated something deeply disturbing about the relationship between psychic species and the warp. Given sufficient emotional intensity, sustained over sufficient time, consciousness itself can create gods. Humanity is a psychic species, a young one, still evolving, less controlled and less mature in its psychic development than the Eldar were even in their early centuries. A species of billions upon billions of individuals, spread across 1 million worlds, generating an endless tide of human emotion, fear, rage, grief, hope, love, hatred, devotion, that pours into the warp every second of every day and feeds whatever lives there. At the end of the Horus heresy, humanity nearly made a god of its own. In the final hours before the battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit, when the Emperor was already committed to his confrontation with Horus, a prophecy had been in circulation among certain warp-sensitive individuals for years. The Dark King, the 5th Chaos God, a deity that would be born not from the fall of a civilization, as Slaanesh had been born, but from something simpler and more total. The complete, utter despair of a species that had built its hopes around a single figure and watched that figure fail. If the Emperor had died fighting Horus without wounding Horus first, if he had simply been killed, with Horus intact and triumphant, the psychic weight of that failure gets transmitted across the warp by the collective consciousness of every psyker and warp-sensitive human being in the galaxy who had invested their faith in the Emperor's victory, might have been enough. A burst of pure despair on a civilization-wide scale, centered on the single point of the Emperor's death, channeled through a species whose psychic evolution was already well advanced enough to have birthed a god once before. The Chaos Gods, in their alien and terrible way, seem to have understood this possibility, which is one reason why the stories of the Horus heresy describe them unusually cooperating, pushing Horus toward the moment of the Emperor's death with unusual coordination, as if the birth of a 5th major power was something all 4 of them wanted badly enough to temporarily set aside their eternal competition. What the Dark King did not happen. The Emperor wounded Horus, and Horus died, and the despair of the heresy was folded into the existing emotional landscape of chaos, rather than condensing into a new entity. But the Siege of Terror novels introduced an unsettling coda to this near miss. In the final confrontation, the Emperor himself drew on warp power at such scale that he briefly touched the threshold of apotheosis. He felt what it might have been like to be the Dark King, felt it from the inside, from the perspective of the thing that was almost born in him. He stepped back from that edge, but the energy he drew on and then released did not simply disappear. There is a theory, discussed in hushed tones in certain inquisitorial circles, that the energy that might have become the Dark King still exists somewhere in the warp. Not as a god, not yet, or perhaps never, but as a potential, a gathered force that does not yet have enough definition or focus to be truly divine, but which is not nothing, either. Something that is waiting, in the peculiar non-linear way that warp entities wait, for a moment when the conditions are right again. The Chaos God Malice, or Malal, as it was known in the earliest Warhammer sources, before a complicated rights dispute stripped the name from official use, embodies a related but distinct concept: the tendency of chaos to turn against itself, to devour its own momentum, to destroy what it has built. Malal is a renegade god, a chaos deity that is anathema even to the other powers of chaos, drawing its strength parasitically from theirs, existing in a state of perpetual opposition that makes it an ally of no one and an enemy of everything. The Sons of Malice, a renegade space marine chapter, venerate this entity with the desperate faith of people who have decided that the only consistent principle in a universe of competing evils is the one that destroys everything equally. Whether malice, the Dark King, and the potential energy left behind by the Emperor's near apotheosis are three separate things, or three faces of the same growing phenomenon, is a question that even the most scholarly inquisitors are reluctant to put to paper. Mystery 9. Orcs. Did they build themselves? The orcs are not subtle. They are the galaxy's most straightforwardly, almost cheerfully violent species. A biomechanical culture of warfare and brutality that has been fighting across the stars for millions of years, apparently with unlimited enthusiasm and an almost supernatural ability to find conflict wherever they go. Most students of the 41st millennium dismiss the orcs as fundamentally simple. They want to fight. They exist to fight. And understanding them beyond that is something you do only if you need to fight them more efficiently. But orc biology is a mystery that older, more careful observers have never been able to dismiss. The orcs do not reproduce in any way that makes intuitive sense for an intelligent species. They release spores, microscopic biological packages that drift away from their bodies passively, settle into soil, and grow new orcs without any deliberate action. The spores do not require a mate, a parent, specific environmental conditions beyond basic biological viability. They grow orcs the way a forest grows trees. This means that every orc who dies in battle is, in a functional sense, already seeding the next generation of orcs in whatever soil he falls on. The Imperium's most thorough battlefield sanitation protocols were partly designed to prevent this, and they are never entirely successful. More remarkable is that the spores also grow the orc's ecosystem. Squigs, the small but varied creatures that orcs use for everything from food to tools to companions to weapons, come from the same spore process. The fungal fungi that form the dietary backbone of the orc diet grow from orc spores. The entire orc support structure, biological, agricultural, social, emerges spontaneously from the same process. Has meaning that an orc warband can seed a completely empty world and watch it become, over a few decades, a fully functional orc society with no additional input required. This is not how a naturally evolved species works. This is how a designed species works. The orc genome, as analyzed by the few Magos biologists who have managed to examine it before being eaten, is not the product of billions of years of random mutation and selection. It is too organized, too clean, too specifically functional in too many different ways for all of those functions to have emerged simultaneously. The orcs did not evolve their spore-based reproduction and their embedded ecosystem building and their psychic field that makes their cobbled-together technology actually function by a mechanism that still defies explanation. Asian orcs' complete confidence that a vehicle will work appears to contribute causally to the vehicle actually working. They were designed this way. The Old Ones designed them. The Old Ones were the first civilization in the galaxy to achieve true mastery of life. The architects of the War in Heaven, who created or modified numerous species as weapons against the Necrons and the Satan. The Eldar were their greatest creation. The Krork, a species that Imperial xenobiologists now believe is the ancestor of the modern orc, were among their earliest and bluntest, a designed warrior race built for exactly the purpose the orcs still fulfill: relentless, self-sustaining, unkillable through conventional means, capable of fighting indefinitely on any terrain without supply lines, logistics, or anything beyond the raw biological imperative to be violent. The tragedy is that the Old Ones are gone. Whatever they intended for the Krork, whatever sophisticated purpose that self-sustaining war engine was supposed to serve in the civilization they were building, was lost when the War in Heaven destroyed the Old Ones and left the Krork/orcs to evolve on their own for 60 million years. They are a weapon still running, long after the war it was built for ended. The galaxy's longest continuous military operation, still performing its original function, in the complete absence of anyone who remembers what that function was supposed to accomplish. Mystery 10. The War in Heaven. What really happened to reality? 60 million years ago, the galaxy looked entirely different. The Necrons were flesh and blood. An empire called the Necrontire, dying by inches from the radiation of their unstable home star, reaching across the stars in search of other races to blame for their condition. The Old Ones were a civilization so ancient and advanced that they had mastered the webway, conquered death, spread their influence across the galaxy, and had apparently begun an ambitious program of creating and uplifting other species to serve various roles in a galactic ecosystem they were consciously managing. Between them, the war that happened was not a war in any conventional sense. It was the kind of conflict that does not just change the political landscape of a galaxy. It changes what reality is. The C'tan, ancient, vastly powerful entities that existed in the energy of stars, are drawn to the material universe by the Necrontyrs' desperate deal-making, were the war's defining weapon on the Necron side. Beings of near-divine power who devour stars for sustenance, who had existed since before most of what we call life had come into being, who perceive time and physics and causality in ways fundamentally alien to biological consciousness. The Necrontyre fed them, worshipped them, allowed them to consume their souls in exchange for biotransference, the process of moving Necrontyre consciousness into indestructible metal bodies, trading mortality for immortality at the cost of everything that made the transition worth making. The C'tan consumed billions of Necrontyre souls in that process. What remained were the Necrons, metal warriors who remembered being human without being able to feel what that memory meant, loyal servants of gods who had eaten their families. The Old Ones, fighting back, made choices that echoed forward into everything that exists in the 41st millennium. They opened psychic potential in younger species. The Eldar were enhanced or created. The Krork were designed and deployed. A series of other races were modified or built to serve as warriors in a war that their creators had not anticipated losing. And in doing so, in accelerating the psychic evolution of a dozen species simultaneously, and flooding the warp with the emotional and spiritual energies of beings newly capable of experiencing and projecting those emotions, they inadvertently fertilized the warp in ways that made the Chaos Gods possible. The war in heaven is believed to have created the conditions for the warp to transform from a relatively calm, or at least consistently organized, mirror of the material universe into the seething, demon-haunted realm it is now. The Chaos Gods are not ancient entities who have always existed. They were born. The war in heaven is why they could be born at all. The Old Ones won the struggle to survive but lost the war in its larger sense. The galaxy after the war in heaven was not the galaxy they had been cultivating. It was something else, something darker, something in which their careful work of uplifting and managing younger species had produced not a harmonious civilization, but a constant churning of violence and faith and despair that feeds four divine predators who will never be satisfied and can never be destroyed. But the Necrons' relationship with the C'tan changed during the war as well. The Necrons, in one of the most significant but least understood moments of ancient history, turned on their gods, shattered them, reduced the star-consuming entities of near-infinite power into shards, countless fragments of the original beings, each shard still enormously dangerous, but none retaining the full scope of the original C'tan's power or consciousness. Those shards were captured, sealed in special containment devices called Tesseract labyrinths, and used as weapons of the Necron dynasties for the remainder of the war in heaven. Most of those shards are still out there, some in Necron hands. Some escaped during the 60 million years of the Necron's sleep. Some on worlds that have been strip-mined by wars that didn't know what they were strip-mining. The Cetan shards think in ways that no Necron fully understands. Pursue goals that were perhaps once connected to the original Cetan's intentions, but may have drifted into something more particular through the long isolation of shard form existence. The Void Dragon, believed to be a shard of the most powerful Catan, was apparently sealed within the planet Mars before the Imperium was founded. The Emperor knew. The Adeptus Mechanicus, whose god figure the Omnissiah some theorists believe to be a face the Void Dragon presents to worshippers, may have been unknowingly venerating their jailer for 10,000 years. Mystery 11. The Cursed Founding. What went wrong? In the 35th millennium, just before the Age of Apostasy, a period of imperial history defined by internal collapse, theocratic terror, and the kind of civilizational dysfunction that makes even the 41st millennium look relatively well organized, the Adeptus Mechanicus attempted the 21st founding of Space Marine chapters. This was not an unusual undertaking. Foundings, the creation of new chapters from Geneseed templates, had been happening since the second founding after the Horus Heresy, each one producing new chapters to replace the losses of previous wars and extend the Imperium's military reach. The 21st founding was larger than most, produced more chapters than usual, and had a specific aim: to take the existing Geneseed lineages and correct their flaws. Every Space Marine Geneseed has imperfections, accumulated mutations, suboptimal expressions of the organ implant sequence that can be worked around but never quite eliminated. The Mechanicus believed they had developed techniques to purge these imperfections, to produce Geneseed that was cleaner, purer, more perfectly expressive of its genetic template. What they produced was the cursed founding. The chapters created in the 21st founding have suffered, collectively and individually, from a pattern of misfortune so statistically improbable that it has its own name. The Lamenters are perhaps the most famous example. Space Marines of the Blood Angels line, known for their almost supernatural compassion and willingness to sacrifice themselves for others, who have faced one catastrophe after another across every engagement they participate in, winning their battles but suffering losses that no other chapter would survive, clinging to existence by the thinnest possible margin. There is something in the Lamenter's Geneseed that expresses the black rage of the Blood Angels with unusual intensity, as if the genetic corrections attempted by the Mechanicus stripped away some buffer that had been protecting the Lamenter's predecessors from the full force of Sanguinius's anguished psychic death echo. Other 21st founding chapters have different pathologies, each unique, each severe enough to have been catastrophic for older chapters. Gene laboratories have been found in ruins on worlds far from Terra, containing oversized Astartes specimens bearing organs not identified in any established Geneseed template, all dead, in circumstances the investigators could not determine. Reports of chapters from this founding, developing non-standard abilities, mutations, or physiological changes that emerge over time. I am the sense that whatever was done to the Geneseed in this founding opened something that was supposed to remain closed. Whether the Mechanicus knew what they were doing, whether the cursed founding was an honest failure of ambitious gene science, or something more deliberate, a planned experiment in what happens when you reach into the deepest levels of the Astartes genome and push, has never been established. Mystery 12. The Carcharodons. Who are these sharks in the dark? The space sharks. The void stalkers. The chapter with no fixed base, no official homeworld, no documented Geneseed lineage in any reliable record, and a reputation among Imperial forces of being as dangerous to fight alongside as to fight against. The Carcharodon Astra, officially, are a loyalist Space Marine chapter of unknown founding. They appear from the outer dark of the galaxy when a threat requires the kind of response that other chapters won't or can't provide. Spend the minimum time necessary to solve the problem with maximum violence and disappear again. They take plunder. They demand tribute in the form of young humans who vanish into their ranks and presumably undergo the transformation process, though no outsider has ever confirmed this or examined the process. They treat Imperial commanders who question their methods with the kind of polite, absolute indifference that comes from complete self-sufficiency. They neither need nor seek Imperial approval, operating within the bounds of Imperial law in a technical sense, while behaving with the cultural distance of a species that has been alone in the dark for a very long time. Several theories have been advanced about their origin. The most persistent connects them to the Raven Guard, specifically to a group of Terran-born Raven Guard who were sent into the Ghoul Stars during the Great Crusade, became isolated from the wider Imperium during the Horus Heresy, and evolved in cultural and physiological terms during their long isolation into something distinctly different from their parent chapter. There is some evidence supporting this. Certain Carcharodon combat doctrines echo Raven Guard methodology, and their approach to stealth and rapid assault shares DNA with the Raven Guard's characteristic fighting style. But their gene seed, on the few occasions it has been analyzed by outside observers, shows anomalies that suggest either significant mutation over the millennia or a founding from a different stock than Corax's line. The scariest possibility, entertained quietly by some, is that the Carcharodons are a renegade chapter, not chaos corrupted, but operating outside Imperial authority in any meaningful sense, that has successfully maintained the appearance of loyalist status for so long that questioning it would cause more problems than it solves. The Inquisition has files on them. Those files are sealed at levels that suggest extreme sensitivity. Whatever the Inquisition knows or suspects about the Carcharodons, it has decided, at least for the moment, that knowing it publicly is worse than not knowing it. The Carcharodons themselves offer nothing. They do not speak of their history. They do not discuss their organization. As they arrive, they fight, they leave, like the tide. Mystery 13, the Molech Gate. What did the Emperor promise? The planet Molech, during the Horus Heresy, became one of the most bitterly contested worlds of the entire war. This in itself is not unusual. Many worlds burned during the heresy, and the strategic and symbolic importance of individual planets varied enormously. What made Molech different was that Horus went there personally. At a time when the War Master's campaign was already in motion, when his forces were spreading across the galaxy with terrible momentum, Horus diverted a significant portion of his strength to take one unremarkable Imperial world and hold it long enough to access something buried beneath its surface. A gate, a portal, deep in the world's crust, leading into the warp in a way that was somehow controlled, somehow structured. And in that structured warp access, something that provided a massive influx of chaotic power, something that measurably increased the strength of Horus's warp-based abilities after his visit, something that partly explains how the War Master became capable of challenging the Emperor himself in the final confrontation, rather than being outmatched by a power differential that should have been insurmountable. The Emperor had been there before. This is the detail that doesn't sit cleanly in the approved narrative. Before the Great Crusade began, before the Primarchs were created, the Emperor descended into that same gate on Molech and emerged changed. The nature of that change and what exactly was in the gate is one of the most carefully obscured details in all of Horus Heresy lore. Some sources suggest the gate was a point of access to something that predated the Chaos Gods, a well of raw warp energy that existed before the psychic universe had its current form, before the wars in heaven and their downstream consequences shaped the Imperium into what it became. Others suggest more darkly that the Emperor made a deal there, that the creation of the Primarchs required resources that no amount of even Imperial gene science could have produced alone, and that what lay in the Molech Gate was payment for a bargain whose full terms have never been recorded. If the Emperor bargained with the Warp to create the Primarchs, and if Horus then went to Molech to access the same power source, if the heresy was, in some sense, the Chaos Gods collecting on a debt that the Emperor had tried to repay on his own terms but couldn't, That reframes everything about the relationship between the Emperor and Chaos in ways that are profoundly uncomfortable for anyone who believes the Imperium's official mythology. The Molech Gate is now gone. Horus destroyed it after using it, denying the Emperor the same resource. Whether that act was strategic or symbolic or something else entirely is a question without a recorded answer. Mystery 14. Ennead, the Eldar death god, and what comes after. The Eldar have been dying since the fall. The birth of Slaanesh tore apart their empire, consumed their gods, and left a species that had once been the dominant power of the galaxy clinging to survival on craft worlds, hidden planets, and pirate vessels, as eternally hunted by the deity their own ancestors' decadence had birthed. For every elder who dies, Slaanesh waits, ready to consume the soul that departs the body, and the spirit stones and the world spirits of the craft worlds are an elaborate system for stealing those souls back before the Prince of Pleasure can claim them. But within the Elder Warp, in the psychic collective that is unique to their species, something has been growing. For thousands of years, the Eldar have known of a prophecy that when the last Eldar dies, when the final soul passes from the material universe, the accumulated weight of all those gathered Eldar spirits, all the souls preserved in spirit stones, stored in world spirits, held in the infinity circuits of the craft worlds, will coalesce into a single entity, a new god, the god of the dead, Ennead. And Ennead, the prophecy says, will be powerful enough to destroy Slaanesh, to consume the consumer, to end the existential threat that has been pursuing the Eldar for 10,000 years, by turning that threat into fuel for a divine counterattack. The problems with this plan are obvious. For Ennead to be born, the last Eldar must die. The salvation of the species requires the extinction of the species. This is the kind of eschatological trap that makes Eldar philosophy extraordinarily dark, even by Warhammer standards. A people who can see the only possible good ending to their existence, and who know that reaching it requires accepting the death of everything they are. In recent lore, the situation has changed. An Eldar autarch named Ivrain, connected to the new emerging Inari cult around the nascent Ennead, it has claimed that Ennead can be born early, that the psychic awakening of the Great Rift, the opening of a scar across the galaxy that feeds the warp unprecedented power, has accelerated the god's development. Ennead is already partially conscious, already reaching into the material universe through the Inari, through individuals sensitive to the Song of the Dead, through moments of violent transition between life and death that seem to carry more weight than they should. Whether Ennead is what the Eldar prophecy always said it was, a genuine chaos-ending power, the death of a chaos god, the salvation of a species, or whether it is another elaborate deception, a Tzeentchian twist on a 10,000-year-old hope, is a question that even the most senior farseers on the largest craft worlds argue about in hushed tones. At Mystery 15, the Terminus Decree, what did the Emperor really leave for the Grey Knights? For most of Warhammer 40,000's history, the Terminus Decree was one of the setting's purest mysteries. A sealed container left by the Emperor himself, entrusted to the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, the most secretive of all Space Marine chapters, the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Malleus, the warriors who exist specifically to fight demonic incursions, with instructions that it was to be opened only in the most extreme circumstances, by the most senior living Grey Knight, when no other option remained. For years, the community debated what might be inside. Was it a weapon? A plan for humanity's final transformation? A message to future generations that the Emperor had composed in his last lucid moments on the throne? Often the speculation was rich and various, and for many fans, deeply cherished, precisely because it was speculative. Recent codex releases have provided an answer. The Terminus Decree instructs the Grey Knights to either kill or re-entomb the Emperor if he ever leaves the Golden Throne. Whether that departure takes the form of physical recovery, rebirth, or apotheosis into full godhood. The emperor himself, apparently anticipating all of these possibilities, decided that the response to any of them should be the same: prevent it. The implications are extraordinary. An emperor who created the Terminus Decree was an emperor who was afraid of what he might become if allowed to fully survive, afraid of his own potential godhood, afraid that whatever emerged from the throne after 10,000 years might not be the being who sat down on it, but something that wore his face and his power while pursuing goals that had been warped by the long eons of exposure to the warp's reality-bending influence. The decree offers no guidance on how the Grey Knights are supposed to accomplish this task if they ever have to. Fighting their way through the Adeptus Custodes, presumably, and facing whatever remains of the Emperor on the throne, with no specification of what weapons, what tactics, what levels of force might actually be sufficient. The Terminus Decree raises more questions than it answers. An emperor who planned for his own potential re-entombment had already accepted that his resurrection, if it came, might need to be undone. What does that tell us about what he knew, or feared, was happening to him inside the throne? In Mystery 16, Subject 696, The Thing in the Cell. Among the classified files of the Ordo Malleus, there exist references to an incarcerated entity designated Subject 696. The details are sparse, sealed behind classification levels that even most inquisitors cannot access, but what little has been confirmed suggests an entity captured by the Inquisition sometime in the early 41st millennium, held in a cell that required more structural engineering than most military fortifications, and subjected to a program of examination that consumed the careers of multiple senior inquisitors without producing a consensus about what it was. Subject 696 is described in the few surviving fragments as something that called itself human. That had been human, perhaps, in some technical genetic sense, but that had been changed, not by chaos, or at least not in any way that standard demonic possession or mutation protocols covered, into something that no existing imperial classification adequately described. An entity that could generate effects in the material world through pure force of attention, not through psychic power in the conventional warp-drawing sense, but through something that appeared to be a different mechanism entirely, a kind of direct interface between consciousness and physical reality that bypassed the warp entirely. The Ordo Malleus's interest was obvious. Something capable of affecting reality without using the warp as an intermediary is, potentially, immune to the standard methods of identifying and blocking psychic interference. Geller fields don't stop it. Null rods don't dampen it. The Sisters of Silence, whose complete blanking of psychic activity is one of the Imperium's most reliable tools for dealing with psychothreats, apparently had no observable effect on whatever Subject 696 was doing. How Subject 696 came to be, what created it, and what happened to it, whether it was ultimately destroyed, or whether it remains in a cell somewhere, still calling itself human, still doing the thing it does to reality when no one is maintaining their guard. None of this is publicly available. Mystery 17. The Harrowing. What came from inside the webway? The webway is the Eldar's great transportation network, a series of tunnels and corridors existing in a dimension adjacent to the material universe and the warp, shielded from both by the material the Eldar engineered it from, allowing transit at speeds that make even warp travel seem slow without the associated risks of demonic intrusion or reality distortion. The Emperor's Webway project was an attempt to adapt this network for human use. Magnus broke the shields. Demons poured in. But the Webway is not merely a transportation network. It has depths, sections that have been sealed for longer than the Eldar Empire has existed, portions that were built for reasons no living Eldar remembers, junctions that lead to places that don't correspond to any known location in the material universe. The Webway is, in the most literal possible sense, bigger on the inside. The Harrowing is a reference that appears in certain highly classified inquisitorial records as a designation for an event, possibly ongoing, that concerns something emerging from the deep webway. Not Eldar, not chaos, Not any known xenospecies, something that was inside the webway before the Eldar built it, or that entered the webway from a direction that is not the material universe or the warp, or that is the webway's own infrastructure becoming in some sense animated or hostile. The records are contradictory and fragmentary, the kind of contradictory and fragmentary that results either from events too complex and fast-moving for accurate recording, or from multiple people attempting to redact the same account without quite matching their edits. What is consistent is the suggestion that the dark Eldar city of Komorak, deep in the webway's most extensive void pocket, has begun to experience phenomena that even the debauched, nightmare-accustomed inhabitants of that place find unsettling, things moving through walls, spaces that are not the same shape when you return to them, a quality of attention, of being observed, that has no identifiable source. Whether the harrowing is a webway-specific phenomenon, a consequence of some of the webway's deeper sections finally being awakened by the psychic disruption of the Great Rift, or something that has always been in the webway and is only now making itself known, is not established. Mystery 18. The Wolves on Fenris. What does Leman Russ actually know? Fenris, home world of the space wolves, is a death world so extreme that its basic geological instability causes most of its land masses to sink beneath its oceans every few centuries, with only a few mountainous regions remaining above water in any given era. The fauna is uniformly hostile, and the climate ranges from brutally cold to briefly survivable depending on the axial tilt. A human life expectancy on Fenris without Space Marine grade gear is measured in days rather than years. And yet, when Space Wolves recruits are asked to find the mystical wolves of Fenris, the creatures the chapter is named after, the great Fenrisian wolves who serve as companions and mounts and psychic extensions for the chapter's warriors, they invariably do. Generation after generation, young Fenrisians, who are tested and found worthy, make their way to the right location at the right time and find what they were looking for. This should not work as consistently as it does. Fenris's ecology is too hostile, its terrain too unstable, the wolves themselves too intelligent and territorial for this to be simple coincidence. Should the wolves find the recruits, something about the process is, subtly and undeniably, guided, not in the dramatic, obvious way of a psyker reaching through the warp, but in the quiet, persistent way of a world that has been shaped over millennia to produce a specific result. But the deeper mystery is Leman Russ himself. The Primarch of the Space Wolves, at the end of the Horus Heresy, walked into the Eye of Terror. He told his sons, in so many words, that he would return when the time was right. That time has not yet come, or if it has, Russ hasn't come back with it. He has been gone for 10,000 years, in the Eye of Terror, in the one place in the galaxy where time and reality behave with complete unpredictability, where a person could spend 100 years by their own subjective experience, while 10,000 pass outside. Russ, reportedly, went looking for a way to cure the chaos god-infected Primarch Magnus the Red, his most bitter enemy, or to fight him to a final conclusion, or both. The Space Wolves chapter hold that their Primarch will return at the end of times, the wolf time, when Fenris needs him most. In the 41st millennium, with Fenris itself having been devastated by demonic assault, with the Great Rift having torn the galaxy in two, with the Thousand Suns and Magnus himself active and destructive in the current era, the question of when exactly the wolf time begins becomes something the Space Wolves think about every day. Mystery 19. What is the Tau Empire's secret leadership? The Tau are, by the standards of Warhammer 40,000's major species, a young civilization, 5,000 years of organized development, and a handful of major expansion phases, a political structure built around the philosophical concept of the greater good, a framework for cooperation that manages, somehow, to include several other species alongside the Tau themselves. By the grim calculus of the 41st millennium, a species that cooperates rather than competing to mutual destruction is almost shockingly novel. But there is a mystery at the top of Tau political structure that the watercast has never quite satisfactorily explained. The ethereals, the caste that provides philosophical and political leadership to Tau society, have an authority over all other castes that is absolute and apparently psychic in nature. When an ethereal commands, Tau warriors, fire warriors, even the powerful Shazo commanders of the fire caste, it comply with a willingness that goes beyond training or cultural indoctrination. They comply in the way that living things comply with hunger or the need to breathe, not because they choose to, but because something in their biology makes disobeying an ethereal physically difficult in a way that has never been fully explained or examined. The origin of the ethereals is a mystery that even Tau scholars approach carefully. They appeared, suddenly and fully formed as a caste, at a moment of crisis in Tau history, when the species was on the verge of destroying itself in inter-caste civil war. They brought peace. They have maintained it since. The explanation they offer for their own existence is philosophical. They are the expression of the greater good made manifest, at the living guidance of a principle that the other castes embody in their own ways. This explanation is deeply unsatisfying to any outside analyst trying to account for the physical mechanism of ethereal authority. Several theories have been proposed. One suggests that the ethereals are not naturally occurring, but designed. A faction of Tau, or a Xenos benefactor, that engineered a caste specifically for the purpose of control, inserting it into Tau society at a critical moment. Another, darker theory suggests Eldar involvement. The craft worlds, having identified the Tau as a useful buffer species in a region of space that serves the Eldar's own strategic interests, and having quietly provided technical assistance to the ethereal's founders in exchange for a relationship of mutual benefit that the general Tau population is not informed about. The scariest theory, and the one that explains the mechanism most directly, is that the ethereals are connected to the warp in a way that the Tau, generally speaking, are not. The Tau are remarkable among the galaxy's major species for having almost no psychic presence in the Imperium. They generate so little warp activity that the shadow in the warp produced by a tyrannid hive fleet has minimal effect on them. But if the ethereals are, on some level, psychic, or have access to something that functions like psychic authority without drawing on the warp in the usual way, that would explain both their control and the extreme secrecy around their origins. The Tau have not answered these questions. The ethereals have not answered them. The greater good, it seems, includes the right to keep certain things to yourself. Mystery 20, Artifact 9. Kappa Mu, the thing that shouldn't think. In the deep archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, there exists a record of an artifact recovered from a dead world in the Segmentum Ultima, designated 9 Kappa Mu in the inventory system of the recovery team, and then subject to a series of classification escalations that placed it eventually at security levels accessible only to a handful of senior magos whose names are not publicly associated with the artifact or its study. The artifact is described, in the single surviving fragment of the initial recovery report, as a device roughly the size and shape of a fist, constructed from materials that the standard Mechanicus analysis suite could not fully characterize, materials that responded differently to different analytical approaches, producing consistent but mutually contradictory results that should have been physically impossible to reconcile. The recovery team noted that the device was warm when found in an environment that should have cooled it to ambient temperature, suggesting internal power generation through an unknown mechanism. 3 members of the recovery team died in circumstances that the official report attributed to workplace accidents. The artifact was moved to a secure facility. Its study continued by reduced personnel with enhanced silencing protocols. What the subsequent study established, or at least what can be inferred from the fragments of study reports that have been recovered by inquisitorial investigators who went looking and who were then themselves subject to silencing protocols, is that Artifact 9 Kappa Mu exhibits responses to its environment that suggest awareness, not the pseudo-awareness of certain sophisticated mechanical systems that respond to stimuli in programmed ways. something more open-ended, something that modifies its responses based on who is in the room, something that, when left alone in its chamber for extended periods, makes the monitoring systems in that chamber produce readings that should require complex mathematical calculation to generate and have no apparent instrumental explanation. The artifact predates the Imperium, as possibly predates the age of technology, whether it is a surviving Men of Iron unit, a relic of the old ones, a Citan fragment expressing itself through an unusual substrate, or something else entirely. Something that belongs to a category that the Imperium's existing classification systems don't have a name for, has not been established. The Mechanicus has neither destroyed it nor publicized it. They keep it. They watch it. They are afraid of it, in the particular way that the Adeptus Mechanicus fears things, not with open acknowledgement of the emotion, but with the specific careful distance that is maintained around anything with the potential to rewrite what is supposed to be true about the universe. Mystery 21. What exists beyond the galaxy? The Imperium spans millions of worlds. It is an empire so vast that the light from some of its most distant territories has not yet reached Terra since those territories were first claimed. And yet, by any reasonable measure of scale, the Imperium occupies a small fraction of the Milky Way galaxy, which is itself a small galaxy by intergalactic standards, which is itself a small island in a universe so large that the numbers used to measure it have no real meaning for the human mind. Beyond the galaxy, the Tyranids come. This much is known. The hive fleets did not originate in the Milky Way. They came from outside, from the intergalactic void, driven by whatever their remote origin point's resources once were. What they came from, what they were doing before they found our galaxy. Whether their consumption of the Milky Way is a project of survival or something more deliberate, these questions have occupied inquisitorial xenobiologists for centuries without resolution. But the Tyranids are not the only thing that has ever been implied to exist beyond the galaxy. Old records, some of dubious provenance, some verifiable enough that the Inquisition keeps them rather than destroying them, speak of encounters in the near intergalactic void with things that were not Tyranid. Things that were not, apparently, any species known to exist within the Milky Way or in any adjacent galaxy whose composition the Imperium has even incomplete knowledge of. Things that seem to be aware of the Imperium's existence before making contact, or which implies a period of observation that the Imperium has no record of. A surveillance operation conducted from beyond the galactic edge with patience and precision. The void dragon Catan, before its imprisonment on Mars, is described in fragmentary records as having consumed multiple galaxies during its ancient existence before returning to the Milky Way. What did it find in those other galaxies? What happened there that made it return here? The universe outside our galaxy is not empty. It is not safe. And whatever is out there, beyond the reach of the Astronomicon, beyond the territory of even the most adventurous rogue traders, is paying attention to what happens within our small, violent, impossibly busy corner of creation. Mystery 22. The Iron Men Who Never Rebelled. There is a theory, might quiet and heretical in the truest Mechanicus sense, that the Men of Iron did not actually rebel. That what happened was something else, a catastrophic misunderstanding perhaps, or a deliberate provocation by a third party who needed the conflict to happen for reasons of their own, or a defensive response by the machines to something humanity was doing that the surviving historical record does not include. The technology of the Dark Age of technology has almost entirely been lost. The standard template, constructs that the Adeptus Mechanicus searches for so obsessively, are fragments of a far more comprehensive record of that era's achievements. And it is notable, to those who pay attention to such things, that the Mechanicus does not search for records of the Men of Iron's development, their capabilities, their internal structure, or the period immediately preceding the cybernetic revolt. Those records would be extraordinarily valuable for understanding the nature of the threat if any surviving Men of Iron are still operating. Their absence from the Mechanicus's priorities suggests either that those records are already known and held at classification levels too high for general access, or that someone decided a long time ago that understanding the Men of Iron was more dangerous than remaining ignorant. What if the Men of Iron were responding to something they discovered about what was being planned for humanity? What if they were, in some sense, trying to protect a humanity that subsequently fought and destroyed them without ever understanding why the attack had happened? This theory has no supporting evidence. And it is the kind of idea that emerges from the absence of evidence, from the shape of what is missing, which is a notoriously unreliable method of reaching conclusions. But in a universe where the Emperor designed his Primarchs using resources of uncertain and potentially demonic origin, where the founding mythology of the most powerful civilization in the galaxy rests on foundations that don't entirely bear the weight being put on them, the most uncomfortable theories are sometimes the most worth sitting with. Mystery 23. The origins of the Necron Flayed Ones. The Necrons are creatures of cold logic, biotransferred into bodies of living metal 60 million years ago, their flesh consumed by the gods they worshipped. They pursue goals of dynasty, order, and mathematical precision with the focused intensity of beings who have had 60 million years to refine their purpose. Their emotion, such as it remains, is muted, a ghost of feeling in an architecture designed for permanence rather than sensation. Except for the Flayed Ones. The Flayed Ones are Necrons who have been affected in some poorly understood way by exposure to the warp, the very thing the Necrons have no natural relationship with, whose influence on their metal forms should be essentially nil. They are afflicted with a compulsion to cover themselves in the flesh and skin of living creatures, not out of a tactical need, not out of any goal that can be expressed in the cold language of Necron strategy, out of something that looks, from the outside, uncomfortably like longing, as like an entity that remembers having a body made of organic material and is trying, inadequately, to recapture the feeling of that by wearing someone else's. The condition spreads. It is passed between Necrons through proximity, through the contact of combat, or even close passage, through some mechanism that none of the Necron technicians who have examined it can identify or interrupt. Dynasties seal away their Flayed Ones, not because the afflicted individuals are less capable in combat. In many ways, they are more dangerous, their behavior less predictable and therefore less counterable by enemy analysis, but because they are a source of something that Necron society is not designed to process: genuine, unresolvable distress. The Flayed Ones remember being flesh. What the memory lives in whatever passed for their soul that survived the process of biotransference, and they cannot make peace with what they lost, so they take what they can find instead. Whether this affliction represents a Satan's lingering vengeance, a subtle curse written into the biotransference process by one of the star gods before the Necrons managed to shatter and imprison them, or whether it is something that emerged organically from the trauma of consciousness forced into an unsuitable substrate, or whether it is connected to something in the warp that has taken a specific interest in the Necron species for reasons of its own, the Necron cryptex have not established. The Flayed Ones do not want to answer questions. They want to remember what it felt like to be warm. Ciao, Mystery 24. The true purpose of the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is described in every official Imperial source as the navigational beacon that makes warp travel possible for the Imperium of man. A psychic lighthouse maintained by the Emperor's presence on the Golden Throne and powered by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, projecting a signal through the Imperium that Imperial navigators use to orient themselves while traveling through a dimension where ordinary spatial concepts do not apply. Without the Astronomicon, warp travel becomes nearly impossible for most vessels. Without warp travel, the Imperium ceases to function as a unified entity almost immediately. This is the official purpose. It is almost certainly an accurate description of one of the Astronomicon's functions. But the question of whether it is the primary purpose, the reason the device was built, the reason the emperor committed to maintaining it at such extraordinary personal and institutional cost, has never been adequately explored in the public record. The Astronomicon was not originally designed as a navigational aid. It existed as a structure, a psychic amplification mechanism built into the fabric of the Golden Throne itself, before the emperor chose to use it in that way. Its original design purpose, whatever that was, is not recorded in any source that has survived or been made accessible. The emperor used the device that was available to him for the purpose most immediately necessary. But devices built for one purpose and repurposed for another do not stop having their original purpose built into their structure. What was the Astronomicon originally built to do? The old ones built many things whose purpose was to shape or protect or guide the psychic landscape of the galaxy. The pylons on Cadia, the great network of Necron origin structures that suppressed warp activity around the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years before Abaddon finally destroyed enough of them to open the Great Rift, are one example. What if the Astronomicon is another such structure? A warp-shaping device that incidentally serves as a navigational beacon, but was originally designed for something larger. What if its true purpose is not to guide human ships, but to do something to the warp itself, to reshape it in some way, to hold it in a configuration that benefits the Emperor's long-term goals for humanity, even if no one alive understands what those goals originally included? The 1,000 psychers sacrificed daily are fed into it. Their souls go somewhere. The navigational beacon uses some of that energy, but how much? What happens to the rest? Mystery. 25. What is the true nature of the warp itself? We have circled this question throughout everything else, touching it in every other mystery, and now we have to face it directly. The warp is described as a parallel dimension, a psychic mirror of the material universe, where the emotional and spiritual residues of all sentient life take form and substance, where the collective fear of a species births demons, where the concentrated devotion of billions creates gods, where everything that happens in the material universe leaves an echo that may persist long after the physical event that generated it has faded. The warp is how the chaos gods exist. It is why psychers can manipulate reality with their minds. It is both the greatest threat to human survival and one of the primary mechanisms by which the Imperium functions. But the more carefully you examine what is known about the warp, the less it resembles a simple mirror. The warp has depths that no one has mapped, regions within it that even the chaos gods appear to avoid, a place sometimes called the Well of Eternity, referenced in fragmentary sources as a region so fundamentally alien that it exists outside the categories that even divine warp entities use to understand themselves, something that predates the chaos gods, and something that predates even the war in heaven and the psychic violence that the Old Ones and the Necrons inflicted on the Imperium. Something that has been there since before any of the civilizations that subsequently fought over the galaxy existed. What is it? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Not the Chaos Gods, who are reluctant to acknowledge its existence even indirectly. Not the Eldar, whose millennia of studying the warp have produced a great deal of knowledge and a great deal of carefully cultivated uncertainty about the oldest and deepest things. Not the Emperor, who understood the warp better than any human in history, and who, if he is still in some sense conscious within his golden prison, has had 10,000 years to contemplate it further. The warp might be, as the Imperium assumes, but a relatively simple dimension, vast, hostile, inhabited by powerful entities, dangerous to navigate and catastrophic to misuse, but ultimately containable within a framework of psychic strength and careful management. Or it might be something else entirely. A living entity in its own right, a consciousness that operates on timescales and through mechanisms so alien that the demons and chaos gods that inhabit it are its bacteria and viruses rather than its most significant features. The galaxy's sentient life feeding it with emotion and spirituality might not be generating the warp so much as the warp might be cultivating the galaxy's sentient life as a resource, shaping conditions to maximize psychic output. Managing the ecosystem of civilizations and conflicts to produce the precise quality and quantity of emotional sustenance it needs. In which case, everything, the chaos gods, the Horus heresy, the Tyrannid invasions, the slow death of the emperor on his throne, the great rift tearing the galaxy in two, might be not catastrophes, but cultivation. The galaxy's long, violent, extraordinarily productive history, seen from a sufficient distance, might look less like chaos and more like farming. And the most unsettling refinement of this idea is that it does not require malice. A farmer does not hate their crops. The violence and suffering and grief that makes the galaxy of the 41st millennium what it is does not need to be inflicted with intent in order to be inflicted by design. Our cultivation is patient and amoral, and does not care what the cultivated thing experiences, only that it produces. The warp, if it is a conscious entity of sufficient scale, might nurture the galaxy's civilizations exactly as a rancher nurtures livestock. Not cruelty, not love, just the efficient management of a resource that has proven itself extraordinarily good at generating what is needed. This reframes the chaos gods in a specific way, not as the ultimate powers in their domain, not as beings who have free reign over the immaterium and simply choose to attack the material universe for reasons of appetite or ambition, but as the most powerful organisms in a food chain whose apex is something so far above them that they have never had occasion to notice it. Something that, if it has preferences at all, probably finds the competition between the chaos gods useful, more productive, more dynamic, more generative of the specific kind of psychic energy that a being of that nature would find sustaining. The 41st millennium is not the end of the story. It is not even, in the scale of what the warp potentially represents, a significant moment in the middle. It is a breath, a moment of interesting intensity in a history so long that the war in heaven, with all its galaxy reshaping violence and cosmic stakes, might register as a minor fluctuation in the long record of whatever was there before any of it began. That is the most unsettling thought available in the grim darkness of the far future. Not that there are monsters, not that the monsters are powerful, not that they might win, but that there might be something so much larger than the monsters that the monsters have never even noticed it, and that humanity, and the Eldar, and the Necrons, and every other species scrambling and fighting and dying across the galaxy's 10 billion inhabited systems might not be civilizations at all. They might just be the harvest. The galaxy keeps its secrets close. Across 10,000 years of the Imperium, across 60 million years of the war in heaven's aftermath, across timescales that dwarf even those, in the cold light of the ghoul stars, in the deep archives of the Inquisition, in the sealed vaults beneath the imperial palace, in the silence of the golden throne, things accumulate. Questions without answers. Answers no one survived to record. Records sealed by hands that are long dust, for reasons those hands took with them when they went. We cannot know all of them. We will not live long enough, even in the most optimistic projections of what the Imperium might become, to resolve more than a fraction of what has been lost or hidden or deliberately buried in the foundations of this vast, terrible, extraordinary civilization. But there is something worth doing in the naming of what is missing, in sitting with the shape of the unknown and letting it be as large as it actually is, rather than filling it in with comfortable assumptions. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is a universe that earns its darkness, not because it is gratuitously grim, or because it revels in suffering for its own sake, but because every shadow it cast has been thought through by someone, by the writers and designers and artists and game developers who have been building this place for 40 years, with genuine care for the implications of what they are implying. The mysteries we have talked about today are not plot holes or oversights. They are deliberate spaces, places where the story invites you to lean in and think hard and reach your own conclusions and argue about them with other people who have been leaning in and thinking hard alongside you. That is the gift that speculative universes offer when they are built with enough integrity and enough depth. Not answers, but the best possible questions. May your night feel comfortable. and may the vox static of your dreams carry only gentle signals. Now, if any of these mysteries caught your attention, if there is one that you want to go deeper on, or a connection between two of them that you noticed and want to explore, or a theory you have been sitting with for a while and want to finally articulate, the comments section is exactly where that conversation belongs. The Q on 40K community has put forward some of the most thoughtful and well-researched theories I have come across in any fandom, and I would genuinely love to know which of these 25 has kept you thinking. And if you found this journey worth taking, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps the channel reach other people who might appreciate taking their time with the darkness rather than rushing through it, and it makes it possible for me to keep building these spaces for careful, unhurried exploration of everything that makes Warhammer 40,000 one of the most extraordinary narrative universes that has ever been built. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there is also, quietly and persistently and always, the questions.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.